So welcome, everyone. It is fabulous to be with you tonight, and I thank you for coming to join with me. I love these open forums, the discussions we have, the questions, the things that we talk about go so far and wide, and really, really beautiful and really interesting. So if you feel comfortable to close your eyes just for a second, just for a moment, and take a breath, a deep breath into your body. And breathe out. And just feel your weight settling into your body. Feel your weight dropping down your body, down through your belly, into your pelvis, into your hips, into your perineum. And just feel the weight of your body resting. The chair, the bed, couch, wherever you are. And just feel into the base of your body. And feel yourself settling into the quiet that's in the base of your body. And feel the stillness that's in the base of your body. And then take a breath in, take a slow, deep breath in. And slowly breathe out through your mouth. And slowly open your eyes. Beautiful. So let's begin with an open frame of questions, anything that you might like to ask, that you might like to share your curiosity about. Type it in the chat box, unmute yourself. This is your time to ask, to share. So in the meantime, while we're waiting for that, I shared something this morning on the WhatsApp group that I said might be an interesting way for us to start tonight. And it's about sexual energy and how our sexual energy can be used and expressed for so much more than just sex. And we get so caught up in the pleasure, firstly, and then we get so caught up and limited in the idea of a sexual experience or the way that we see our sexual experiences. And when we can shift them into a portal, into a way that builds an incredible amount of energy in the body, into an experience that really gets us into our bodies, an experience that gets us deeply relaxed and allows emotions to come to the surface and to awareness. That's where we start to see that our sexuality, our bodies and our genitals, can be so much more than the very narrow way that we've been conditioned to see sex. And then pleasure in this becomes a almost a byproduct. Um, and, excuse me. So pleasure becomes um, part of the experience, but it's not the focus. And so often the pleasure is the focus. And, we talk so much and teach so much about having more pleasure and having greater pleasure experiences. And I wrote a piece once saying that I think at best we experience about 30% of the pleasure that we are capable of, which was quite an arbitrary number at the time. But over time, I've seen something in that. So whether it's 30%, whether it's 40%, it doesn't make a whole lot of difference. Generally, we don't come close to the pleasure that we're capable of. But the pleasure on its own is kind of limited. And when the pleasure is in a bigger context, when it's more about the energy of that, because the more pleasure that we feel, the more energy that there is in our bodies. And the more energy that there is that's available, the more either the wisdom of the body can direct that somewhere, the wisdom of our being directs that and uses that in very particular and in very specific ways. And then we start to see that we're actually going beyond the pleasure, through the pleasure, into something else. So the pleasure, in a way, becomes like the vehicle to get to those deeper places. And part of this is a mindset. It's getting out of that mindset of just being kind of really fixated on the pleasure and the experience just being about pleasure. So we have to bring a curiosity. We have to bring something that says, what else is in the experience? What else could there be? And that takes us into the unknown. So the way that we generally have sex is quite patterned, which means that we do pretty much the same thing in the same way. And it works to whatever extent it works, or to whatever extent we think it works. But we generally have our sexual experiences in pretty much this patterned way. And when we begin to firstly expand the pattern, and we begin to explore, and we begin to allow for deeper and for different experiences, we're actually moving into the unknown. And this is important because when our experiences are quite patterned, we pretty much know where they're going and we know how they're going to end. We very often know what the feelings are, what the sensations are. And we actually, to some extent, the more that we do something like that in quite a patterned way, the more numb we become. And the more our focus is on the end of the experience, which, for most of us is the idea of orgasm. But when we start exploring and when we start allowing for something different and for broader, deeper, wider experiences, then we actually go to a place that is the unknown. We go into the mystery. Because we go to places where the feelings and the sensations are different, where sometimes they are very different and sometimes they are more intense. And sometimes there's a whole lot more energy in the body, and sometimes there's a whole lot more emotion, there's a whole lot more feeling that's coming up, and there's a whole lot of energy in our body, which for many of us becomes a very, very different experience. And that starts to take us into different places. That starts to take us into different awarenesses, different emotions that arise. And then we see how the portal of sexuality, of our bodies, of our genitals, and of pleasure opens to show us something else, to show us something more. And sometimes this can be, especially in emotions, it can bring up an enormous amount of anger or rage. It can bring up an enormous amount of hurt. And the point of this is that in consciousness and in conscious sexuality, let's just digress for a moment. The definition of conscious sexuality that I work with is about being present in the experience and allowing whatever it is that arises, whatever it is that emerges, to be there. So it might bring up anger. It might even bring up suppressed memories. And that's the way in to heal so much. And then we see that our sexuality was the doorway, was the the pathway in to that. And that just gives us a very, very different experience rather than simply the patterned orgasmic experience. And when we start delving deeper into energy and deeper into the spiritual side of sexuality, to the mystical side of sexuality, we start to see how our sexuality, our sexual energy, and our pleasure actually becomes a way into expanded states of consciousness. So, as one example of this, around the cervix in a woman's body, for example, so there is a psychedelic called ayahuasca, South American psychedelic. And the active ingredient in ayahuasca is called DMT. And the area around your cervix, stimulated in the right way, can actually produce DMT, which starts to take you into an expanded state of consciousness. There is a point on the palate in men and women's bodies. And when that point is held and stimulated, like if you put your thumb in your mouth and you're sucking it against the roof of your palate, and you do that for a little while, that starts to produce very low doses of DMT, but it starts to take us into some very, very different states of being. And, one of the practices that I teach is called expanded orgasm. And there was somebody who wrote a PhD thesis on expanded orgasm as being a viable means of reaching expanded states of consciousness. And she took it was a woman called Patricia Taylor who did this in America. And she looked at the definition and the elements of an expanded state of consciousness, and expanded orgasm covers absolutely every one of those. So, as much pleasure as there is in an expanded orgasm experience, it can take us so much deeper into that space of deeper consciousness. So we see then that our sexuality and our sexual energy is so much more than we thought it was. And, in the Western world, because our sexuality is firstly incredibly judged, where we have so much guilt, so much shame, so much embarrassment about sex, about desire, about eroticism, where for many people it's very, very limited. It's a very narrow expression. And it's become so much of an expression based firstly on porn, and secondly based on what Hollywood, what the media, and Hollywood is media around the world, how that shows sex to be. And both of those are kind of fantasy and illusion that have nothing to do with reality. And it's only in some of the Eastern traditions and in the West for a long time, but in really small little pockets, that the awareness of sexuality and sexual energy as vitality, as life force, as creativity came to awareness, and practices around that. And that's quite important, because there we see sexuality and sexual experience as a practice. In the same way that you would do a meditation, in the same way that you would do a breathing practice, sexuality and sexual experiences were a practice of energy, of opening the energy channels in the body, of a way into these deeper states. And when we control sexuality, which is so much of what the patriarchal religions have done, the Judeo-Christian and Islamic religions, when so much of that is about controlling sexuality, firstly, it makes it deep and dark. It makes so much of sex forbidden, and especially then those higher states. And today, so much of our world is about keeping us in that kind of porn model, because it's so much the consumerism of sex rather than the deeper experience of sex. And it just kind of keeps us coming back for more and more and more but in such a narrow band, and often such a like a shadow expression of what sexuality is. So the question here is, for a layman, how can we start to expand on our sexual experience if not focusing on an orgasm? Where do we start? So it's a great question. And that's what so much of the journeys that we do are about, the workshops and the learning, because it is a learning. And part of it is that we need a guide on a journey like this. We need somebody who's walked a little bit further down the road, who knows a little bit. You know, there was a great question in a tantric forum a while ago. And let's just digress for a moment. When we talk about tantra, and I wrote something about this for the introduction of my newsletter tomorrow. When we look up tantra on the web, firstly, the first things that come up, pages and pages, are all about sex. And you go on Instagram or you go on Facebook and you go onto some of the websites, and all of this tantric stuff is these beautiful locations and all these beautiful people in these like flowing clothes, and it all looks amazing. And that's a really small portion of what Tantra actually is, because that's what we think sells, you know, and we all want to look like that, and we all want to go to Bali and have these amazing, beautiful venues and all of that stuff. So that's something that's more called Neo-Tantra. Neo-Tantra is very much the sexual side of things. And if you do a little bit of research and a little bit of reading, you start to find out that Neo-Tantra is not nearly as ancient as we have been told. You know, we love that. We love that word ancient, and we love the word secret. And as soon as we hear those words, it's like we are in hook, line, and sinker. But a lot of that isn't. And it might be based on some ancient principles, maybe, depending on how it's taught, depending on the context, on so many different things. But then there's this very deep spiritual tradition of Tantra that's been around for 6,000, 7,000 years, that has a continuous lineage of teachers of learning and practices. And then we look at consciousness and how consciousness work is developing. And we look at how so much of neuroscience is developing, and how so much of all of this is becoming part of our sexuality, and how we're bringing all of these different experiences into sexuality. So this is where having a guide does become important, simply because where do we start and what do we do in this world? And, you know, if you go looking for Tantra and Tantric learning, you're going to find so many different things and so many different possibilities. So the first part of it really is learning to connect with your body and learning to be present in an experience. So learning to be present means that we're not focused on the end of the experience. So for most of us, the end of the experience is the orgasm. That's where our focus is. So as soon as we take that away, and that doesn't mean that you shouldn't have orgasms, because orgasms are fabulous. You can have so many different kinds of orgasms, and orgasm does such wonderful things for the body. It's just that's not all that there is. There's so much more. So the first thing is, if we take orgasm away, something in that starts to shift. And if we start to slow everything down, which is the next part of this, we start to feel more, because when we're moving really quickly, we don't actually feel a whole lot. So most of us have what we call friction sex, and friction sex is just kind of rubbing skin as hard and fast as we can to get to the orgasm. So whether it's a lingam inside a yoni, whether it's a clit that we're rubbing, whether it's something with your hands, with your mouth, the idea is harder and faster until we get to the orgasm. So slow everything down. And as soon as you slow everything down, you start to feel. Then you start to become a little bit more present in your body, and you start to have a different experience of energy. And one of the easiest ways to do this is to become more aware of your breath during the experience. To consciously breathe, slow, deep breaths. And as soon as everything is slower, and as soon as you're breathing, and as soon as you start to feel more, what happens in that space is your body becomes much more relaxed. So in what we'd call a traditional sexual experience, it's all about contraction. And that's the kind of orgasm that most people have. So as you get closer to orgasm, everything in your body gets tighter. Muscles get tighter, breathing gets quick. Then you have this explosion and you scream or shout, or if you're the quiet type, you just go, oh, that was nice. And that's all that we do. But it's contraction. So as soon as you're breathing, as soon as you've slowed everything down, your body relaxes more. And as soon as your body is more relaxed, energy can move in your body. Because when everything's contracted, energy can't move, energy can't flow. And when you're slowing down and you're more relaxed and you're breathing and you're feeling more, you're more present in your body and you're more present with your partner. And that on its own, even in self-pleasuring experiences, it's exactly the same. And as soon as we do that, we start to slow everything down. And then it's learning some specific practices about connection. So think about how most of the sexual experiences we have follow pretty much, again, that pattern that we call foreplay. And as a woman, if you're lucky, there's lots. And sometimes for men, that's really important as well. But we do that in pretty much the same way. So we touch, we kiss, we rub, we lick, we do whatever it is that we do in pretty much the same way. Even before we start doing that, taking time to connect, to sit opposite your partner, to look into each other's eyes, to greet each other as lovers. And when we're doing that, we're starting to get into a different space in our bodies, a different space in our hearts. As soon as that happens, we allow the experience to become different. And there are so many different practices and ways to connect. And then so many different ways of learning to breathe, so many different specific experiences. But to go back in the beginning, the most important thing is get out of the goal of orgasm. Slow everything down. Breathe, relax. And just doing that starts to change the experience enormously. And what happens in that space is we allow something to arise. We allow something to emerge. And in the beginning, this can be quite confusing because our bodies, after years of doing the same thing in the way that we generally do sexually, we kind of keep doing the same thing. So our bodies get very used to that. And then something new comes along. And we don't always know really what to do with that because the feelings are different, the sensations are different. And if at some point we say, okay, so we're not going to have an orgasm, let's just stop and let's just lie together and feel the energy in our bodies. And there's part of us that's going, huh? What's going on? Because it didn't end in the way that we're used to. And we feel kind of, well, this is incomplete. It's just a pattern because we've been used to doing the same thing for so long. And after a little while, we become open to new patterns. Like I've got a cup of tea here. And if I'm always used to having tea with honey or with sugar, for example, and then all of a sudden there's no honey and there's no sugar, then the tea is strange and I don't even know if I like the tea. But after a little while of drinking it with no honey, no sugar, it becomes the taste of the tea. I have a great coffee story about that, by the way, because you know that I really enjoy coffee. Okay, there's more than one way to orgasm. How slow is the slow? Well, let's answer that one first. How slow is the slow? So slow down, then slow down even more, then slow down even more. And then when you think you're going slowly, make sure that you go even slower. So think about this, for example. One of the things that I developed from expanded orgasm, because expanded orgasm is essentially a practice that you're using your hands on your partner's genitals. It's an experience that you give to your partner and that your partner gives to you, and you're just using your hands. And when I started teaching this over time, I thought, is there a way that we can actually have a penetrative experience with the principles of expanded orgasm? And I started thinking about that. So part of that is an experience of your lingam going into your partner's yoni. Now, think about how long the vaginal canal is. Think about how long a lingam, a cock, is. That penetration is actually really pretty quick. Okay? Can your penetration be one full breath, one slow breath? And that starts to become a very, very different experience. So, how slow is going to be very different on different occasions. But when you think you're going slower, go even slower, and then go even slower, and you start to explore. And in that slowness, in those micro movements, an enormous amount starts to arise. But we need to open our sensitivity first for that to happen. Okay. Did that answer the question of how slow is slow? Because there's not a speedometer that we're measuring it. More than one way to orgasm. So firstly, for women, there can be anything between 12 and 17 different kinds of orgasms, depending on what you might put together. So most women are familiar with clitoral orgasms, and those are the contractive orgasms. And they can be very powerful. They can be really beautiful. They're a whole release. And they're quite short-lived. So that kind of orgasm is 15, 20, maybe 30 seconds, maybe a little bit more, but not a whole lot more for men and women. And then we start looking at things like G-spot orgasms, A-spot, P-spot, blended orgasms, cervical orgasms, perineal orgasms, anal orgasms, nipple orgasms, eargasms and toegasms, and this whole world of possibility. Men can have orgasms that are non-ejaculatory, where orgasm and ejaculation are actually separate processes in the body. Men can have more melting orgasms than contractive and explosive orgasms. So that might give you some idea. Then we start to get into the idea of being orgasmic rather than having an orgasm. So being orgasmic, and we can also get into full body orgasms. So being orgasmic is the body being filled with sexual energy, filled with pleasure energy, that it's a whole body experience, but it's not just a focused genital experience, which is kind of what we're used to. So the world of orgasm becomes very different. Now, this is kind of interesting because the internal orgasms for women, like G-spot orgasms, P-spot, cervical orgasms, all of the deeper experiences feel different. And sometimes they all feel quite different. So when you're just used to that contractive clitoral orgasm, and then you start having different experiences, you don't always know that you've had an orgasm because you're comparing it to what it is that you think an orgasm is. And when we start expanding that, when we start exploring what's happening in the body, then we start to understand that each one of those experiences feels very, very different because they're not all contractive. Some are just the opposite. Some are absolutely melting and opening. Some are more subtle, and these waves of pleasure move through the body for 15, 20 minutes, even longer. So there's a mind shift as well as a body shift. Has that answered the question? It sounds like in order to have a new experience, I need to change my mindset. And that itself seems to be a large shift, even if I want to. Absolutely. So it needs two things. It needs the mind shift needs to change. And so does what we do need to change. And when those work together, then worlds of possibility open. And I really say that in a way that this world of pleasure, of sensuality, sexuality, eroticism, sensation is limitless. I've been teaching and exploring and experiencing for around 30 years in this field. And I'm still discovering more. I'm still learning more. I'm still experiencing more and new things coming up all the time, which are so exciting. So the if I want to that's really the bottom line. And the intention, it starts with an intention. Would I like to have more pleasure? Would I like a deeper experience of sex? Would I like more intimacy? Would I like more connection? And a big part of us is about possibility and potential. So within us is potential for so much in life. And in so many areas of life, we do keep reaching and we do keep expanding that potential. Like one of my exercise things is I swim. And part of that is increasing the distance that I swim or increasing the intensity of a swim. And that's an expansion. And then it's learning a little bit about swimming, about strokes, about breathing, about all kinds of things. That's an expansion. Spirituality is really important to me. It's not a thing that I do, it's such a part of my life. So learning continuously, expanding in that is part of the spiritual potential within us. The sexual potential that we have, which is very linked to the potential of the heart, because our heart and our genitals are very, very connected. They're one energy system. Nothing in our body is happening in a vacuum. I wrote a line a little while ago that was about you can't separate your heart, you can't separate your mind from sex. You can't separate so many things from sex in the same way that you can't separate your genitals from the rest of your body when you're having sex. They're not kind of detachable. We use them and then we put them back again. So everything is a part of our sexuality. And the question is, would you like a deeper experience? Would you like a higher experience to learn more, to explore more? And there's no right or wrong answer to that, and there's no judgment on whatever the answer is. The potential within us is absolutely amazing. And as I've shared, it's a pathway to so much more. And that requires a conscious engagement with our sexuality. So a lot of us have sex in a way that, we've shared is very patterned, it's very conditioned. And we have the experience that we have, which might just be nice, might be fabulous, it might be a distraction. So this is an interesting thing in this. Why do you have sex? And there was a really big study done a couple of years back at all of the top colleges in America. And I don't know how many reasons the researchers expected to come up with, but it was something like over 200 reasons why we have sex. So if you start thinking about why do you have sex? Are you having sex just to have an orgasm? Because that helps you go to sleep. Are you having sex because you want to keep the peace? That's okay. Are you having sex because you want more intimacy? And that's quite a big one. But then we have to ask, is the kind of sex that we're having an expression of intimacy? Because a lot of us actually use sex as a bypass for intimacy. So if you think about the intention of sex, that gives you some direction as to would I like to experience more? I hope that makes some sense. How does age impact new experiences? It doesn't. Well, to some extent, it does, but essentially, new experiences are there if we would allow them to be there. So if we get very stuck in beliefs, if we get very stuck in patterns, if we get very stuck in inhibitions and limitations, and sometimes that doesn't have a lot to do with age, but generally, because we live such patterned lives, the beliefs that we have, the patterns become deeper set. But if our belief is about exploration, if our belief is about possibility, I work with people of all ages. We've had people of over 70, in their late 70s on workshops. People who have come in to learn about sex, and they're having the best experiences of their lives. So I think that's more a belief than anything else. Just because you're older, whatever that means, doesn't mean anything stops. It might be different, and your body might not be able to do the same things in the same way as when you were younger. But the limit of the experience of that is more, I think, a belief than anything else. So it can be a limitation and it can be a freedom. What do you think about all that?
Shanti, what I hear, there's quite a lot of integration, and it's not standalone processes. If I can call it processes, the word's not the right word. But it's not only one thing to focus on. There's quite a lot of things that you need to look at simultaneously.
Yeah, because our sexuality is in the context of our lives. Like I say that lots. It's not in a vacuum because it's linked to what we believe. And if our beliefs about life are limited, then our beliefs about sex are limited. If our beliefs about pleasure are limited, then our beliefs about pleasure in life is limited. The more we connect with our sensuality in so many different ways, um, expands our sexuality, at our hearts, at our emotions, at so many different things, because everything is a part of this wonderful experience. Finding an experience that suits my age. So I would ask maybe if you want to share what your age is. Um, and sometimes finding the experience that suits that. So 58, I mean, I'll share this with you. I'm older than that. And I am constantly having new experiences in every aspect of life. So it's more a mindset than anything else, and it's more a belief than anything else. And the way that you find the experiences that suit that is through experience, through learning, and then through how you integrate that and use that in your life. That becomes really important, and that's the way that you do it. And an experience that suits your age is also to some extent a belief. At 58, I shouldn't behave like this. Well, maybe you should. Why shouldn't you? What expectations are there that are maybe other people's and not yours? So maybe those are some interesting questions. And then there isn't a right age and there isn't a wrong age. But what are the experiences that will allow you to have the experiences that you would like? So there's a very powerful question to ask of all of these. And the question is, what's in the way? So if it's maybe it's a belief that's in the way, that's something that can be worked with. I have no idea of your state of health, the state of your body. That might be a limitation in some way. There's lots of ways to work around so many different things and do so many different things. So that's a really powerful question. What's in the way of having the deeper, higher experiences that you might like to? And I spend a lot of time with people on this journey, and I was having a conversation with a couple of people who've been doing this work for about a year, and they've been learning for about a year. And where they are now in their lives, in every aspect of life, compared to the beginning of this journey, is so different. Because when our sexuality starts to change, when our vitality starts to change, when our sensuality starts to change, when our creativity starts to move, so much of life moves with it. We become more comfortable in our bodies. So if we're more comfortable in our bodies, we're more confident. We are more comfortable in whatever situation we might be in. Just as one example of how that changes things in life. Beautiful. So I think that's a lot to contemplate in that. And if you have any other questions, you're more than welcome to message or email. Thank you all so much for sharing with me. I hope that you have a beautiful evening. I wish you so much pleasure. And again, thank you. I love this sharing, and I'm really grateful for the space to do that.
Thank you, Janti.